Hey everyone, welcome to another video in the 0 to 100 web development series. In this video, we're going to be looking at CSS positioning, the different types of positioning and what each of them mean. And we're also going to cover the solution to the challenge from the last video. Before we get started, I want to go over what a parent-child relationship is. If you think about our HTML document, our HTML is a parent to our body and head elements, and our body is a parent to our header. Our header is a child to the body, and our body is a parent to the header. It's kind of like that. So anything nested with one another, that's a parent-child relationship. Now that we got that out of the way, let's jump right in. The first type of positioning is the static position, and this is the default position for an element, and it is positioned where it occurs within a document. So if you have, in this case, if you have a div, a div, a div, and then an image, well, that is how it's going to be rendered. And it's going to be rendered in block format, so it's going to be block display, I should say, and it's going to be spanning all the way across your document. And even though this image might only be that size, it's going to have a display of block that we can't see, but the browser is putting margins all the way around it. Moving on, the second one is the relative position. Now, the relative position is pretty much is when you apply it to a div or an element, it can be manipulated based off of its default position. So if you look at our static here, we have an image, a div, another image, and a div, but we want to move this image in particular. So in our CSS, we're going to say image, we're going to say position is relative, and left 40 pixels. And as you can see here now, it's relative. It was relative to its original position, so it's left 40 pixels from its original position. The most common case for using relative positioning is when a child element is absolutely positioned, which is what we're going to look into right now. Absolute positioning. Absolute positioning is used to place the element on a specific spot of the web page relative to the closest non-static parent. If there was no non-static parent, the default one or the most nearest one would be the initial containing block, which is essentially a rectangle that holds the root element, our HTML document, and its children. This block has the dimensions of the viewport, and it's anchored to the top left of the canvas. So it's not relative to the window, it's relative to this document, this initial containing block. So as you can see here, looking at these diagrams that I've clearly drawn out myself, we have our document, and inside of it we have our div1, and then our div1 is just this div1 is actually positioned relative. It doesn't have any top or left values or right values set. It's just relative so that it is it's going to be relative for the absolute children underneath it. That way, because if we were to just leave it normally, then it's just a static. It's a static element, and then our absolute positioned elements won't be relative to it. So in order for these to be relative to our parent, we have to put our parent to relative so it's not non-static, if that makes sense. I hope I'm explaining that properly. So we have our div1 to be non-static, so we set it to relative, which doesn't change its position. It just pretty much the same position as static, but we're just saying we don't want it to be static. We want it to be relative so that our absolute positions can be relative to it. So then we have div2, which is 20% absolutely positioned. Top is something, but the right is 20%. And then our div3 over here is only kind of the bottom left corner, and it's 10% from the left. The nice thing about this is that it's because it's relative, meaning that if we were to scale this up a little bit bigger, this is still going to be 10%, and this is still going to be 20% from the right. And if we scale it up full screen or just wide it out, it's still 10% and it's still 20%. Those values do not change. Keep in mind that using absolute positioning places the element on a higher Z index or Z index, meaning it will overlay other elements and it won't disrupt the flow. So you will have this, think about, it's essentially another piece of paper on top of your paper, and it can cover any underlying elements. This works well for things that need to be in a specific position on your document, on your web page, like a navigational menu, hint hint, or like a pop-up or a modal, um, something like that. So our next one is fixed. Now, fixed positioning is used to place an element on a specific spot, like absolute positioning, but instead of it being relative to the first non-static element, it's relative to the viewport. This means that regardless of scrolling, like I have in my diagram here, regardless of scrolling or resizing, the element will maintain its position. So the most common example of this is when you want to have a fixed header or footer. Like in my diagrams here, as you can see, the indicator of it being scrolled, and our header is still fixed to the top left of our window. Typically, you should only have something in fixed positioning if it's going to be greatly useful when navigating through the web page. Like, I don't have it drawn out here or an example of it, but I know off the top of my head on my mobile phone. I know it's an app, but it's a similar concept. On my Gmail app, on the bottom right corner, there's the compose, that little circle with the plus. That compose message button is always there. No matter how far I'm scrolling down my messages, that button's always there because it's fixed to the window, to my screen size. Actually, it might not be. It might be absolutely positioned and relative to a document, but I hope you kind of get the example of where I'm going with that. The fact is that it should be fixed positioning because it is something that could be used regardless of where you are on the website or on that page. And the last one, this isn't a this isn't a value for the position property. Float is its own property with different values. So, but it is kind of similar to absolute positioning. So with absolute positioning, we talked about how it is on a different z index, and it overlays any underlying elements. Therefore, it's not disrupting the flow of elements that are being positioned, whereas float does. Float indeed does. So if you take a look at, we have an example here. This would be a static. So this would be default. We have some paragraph tags. We got and 2 images. We want to float to the right. It's going to pop these boys one by one. So it's going to take this one, shove it to the right. Then it's going to take the next one and shove it to the right until it hits something, which would be our first image. And then it's going to flow the text. So it's disrupting the flow of these paragraph tags, but it's aligning these images to the right. And if we were to do the left, it's the exact same thing. And as you can see here, this looks very much similar to like a newspaper article. And that's something where you might want to use this. Then maybe, actually it would be, because if you want to disrupt the flow of text, if it's essentially having an inline image, is what it is. Float is great for elements that are interactable. So if I were to add images or take away images, and they were to using float would be great, because then they could just slide off and realign themselves, or without creating any gaps. It would close the gaps because it's floating until it just goes until it hits the next thing. And therefore, it's interacting with another object. Which is why it's different than absolute positioning, because absolute positioning doesn't have any control on its own. You have to explicitly set, hey, I want you to be at these dimensions, whereas float's like, you know what, we'll throw you off to the side and just kind of, make your way until you hit something. Those are kind of the differences, and they both have different purposes. They're both useful, There's not a right way. They're both useful and they're both great, but I feel like there always is a right time to use one and a wrong time to use one. So now that we kind of went over the different positions for now that we kind of went over the different types of positionings in CSS, let's go back into PHP Storm and take a look at how we can change our navigation menu to, instead of being a float, because we're not our navigation menu isn't going to be interactable. There isn't going to be anything that's hitting it. It is going to be interactable from the user standpoint, but from an HTML and element standpoint, it's just going to be a standalone element. Therefore, we will make it absolute positioning. So let's head on over into PHP Storm and change up some of our CSS. Okay, now that we're in PHP Storm, let's remove our float right. Now you guys might be wondering if you can, I don't know if you guys will be able to see this at the bottom. I changed up how my recording software works, so now we can probably see the context menus. Hooray! Woo! So much fun. So we're actually gonna take out float here, and we are going to say position is absolute. And because we don't technically need, we could have margins on an absolute positioned element. The problem is though, it's because if it's a layer above everything else, those margins are really going to be useless. There really isn't going to be a use for having margins, essentially. Your top, left, right, and bottom properties kind of replace your margins. So instead of margin, we are going to say our top will be 1.33 ems from the top, and our right is going to be 0. Now, if we wanted our navigational menu on the left side, we wouldn't have right of 0, we would have left of 0. Or if we didn't want our navigation menu to be on the top, we wanted it to be 1.33 ems from the bottom, then we could do that as well. You can change it up to whatever you like. You just can't have a left. Actually, you could have a left and a right. I believe if you have right at 0 and left at 0, it center aligns your element. But because now, so let's save this. We got to remember though that our absolute position value is not going to be relative to our header, because our header is not relative. So let's go ahead and change. Actually, well, I'll show you guys if we really even need to. So we'll save this. Let's head on over to our Chrome here, to our website, refresh, and you can see nothing has changed. That means that we were successful. And we can check to see if our changes have gone through. We can click on our nav element here, and we can see that our position is absolute. And we have a top of 1.33 ems, and our right is 0. Perfect. That means everything is working exactly as intended. And if we really wanted to, we can enforce our own padding into here. Because it is right of 0, we could technically say right of, I think, what does 1em look like? 1em doesn't look too bad. That might be something we might look at. We could even say 1.33 just to kind of keep, consistency, make it look even padding on every side. That's also an option too. The one big concern that I had is when using absolute positioning in this case, because our header is always going to be the same width as our viewport, we don't necessarily need to make our header relative, because if it's always going to be spanned across all the way, then our navigational menu will always be sitting on the top right as well, therefore giving the impression that it is relative to the header. And a way I can prove this is that, let's go on to our header here, and instead of having our width at 100 view widths, if we set it to 50, you notice that our navigational menu is not here. It should be relative to our header. It's actually over here still, and it's actually relative to the initial container block that we talked about. So to keep things consistent and to keep things okay, because we're not some things could change. The width of our header might change for whatever reason. I doubt it would, but in case, a fail-proof plan is to always just make it, well, fail-proof. That's a fail-proof plan, is to always make it fail-proof. Let's hop back into PHP Storm. I'm already starting. I'm already jumping into it. Set our position to not 50, to relative. Yikes. The long day. We save this. We head back over. We refresh. And let's just do a little change here. Let's change our width to 50. And you notice our navigational menu stays the same. Perfect. That's what we want. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Just going to refresh this to reset it. Another change though, I did like that padding change. So let's go back here and we're going to put the right to 1.33 ems. Actually, I say padding. Technically, it's a margin, but whatever. It is what it is. And on our H4 element, let's also put a margin hyphen left of 1.33 ems as well, just to make it consistent. We save that. We head on back over, we refresh, and you can see now that we have a margin here, and we have a little margin here. I hope you guys got close to the solution for this challenge. If not, oh well, there will be more. Don't you worry. It's not like there's points or anything, but there could be. Thanks again for watching this video on CSS positioning. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below. Please like, favorite, subscribe. Favorite? Is that even a thing anymore? Thanks again for watching, guys. Have a great day. Peace.